Hi, I'm Don Stevens. We're going to begin a study of the book of Judges, starting with chapter 1 on this particular tape, and go through the entire book of Judges. There's a lot to be learned there, a lot to study, a lot of things that can be applied to our everyday lives today. I think it's important that we cover this massive subject included in the book of Judges. Now, the book of Judges covers that historical period of time of the nation of Israel from the time of the death of Joshua to the beginning of the time when kings actually ruled in Israel. We don't know just how long a period of time that God actually used judges, but most scholars will agree that that period of time was between 300 and 400 years. This is chapter 1. During this period of history in Israel, there were 13 different judges. Each of these God raised up in those times of Israel's spiritual weakness. When God raised up each of these judges, Israel would see a spiritual revival. And during that time of spiritual revival, God would give Israel victory over their enemies. Eventually, and each time, the revival would fade, the folks would turn to these false gods, and the nation of Israel would fall into captivity. You can see that the nation of Israel was at a bit of a roller coaster ride because there were 13 judges. Under the 13 judges of Israel, we're going to see that there were 13 revivals, 13 falls into sin, 13 periods of captivity, and 13 periods of deliverance. The deliverance came from the oppression of their enemies. There are vast and valuable lessons to be learned from the book of Judges. My plan is to cover each chapter in Judges, one lesson at a time, so that we can all see some of the valuable lessons to be learned from this period of history in Israel. I also have high hopes that you'll utilize this information to help share with your family and friends. For those of you that might be students of the Bible, or at least regular readers of the Bible, you'll recall that the book of Joshua began with the words, "Now after the death of Moses." The book of Judges begins much in the same way, only this time it begins with the words, "Now after the death of Joshua." It's interesting that the book of Judges does not follow any precise chronological order. It begins with after the death of Joshua, but the death of Joshua is actually recorded in chapter 2 of the book of Judges. It also goes back to pick up a little of the book of Joshua, including Caleb's capture of the city of Hebron. Now after the death of Joshua it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, "Who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" And the Lord said, "Judah shall go up. Indeed, I have delivered the land into his hand." Now we know that Joshua had led them in the conquest of the land. And after that, he apportioned out the various territories. But they had not totally driven out the enemy, nor did they possess all the territory that God had given to them. So now, after the death of Joshua, they were ready to go in and take the land. And they asked, of course, who shall go up first? Now the Lord answered them by telling them to send Judah first. The natural question for any of us is, well, how did the Lord say this? Well, the Lord spoke to them through the Urim and the Thummim. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing those right, but these things were worn by the high priest. And they did this through a series of questions, all of which were yes or no answers. They got a yes, they'd continue to questioning, maybe until they fine-tuned it. They'd go through a long list until they got a yes. And then they went on from there. I mean, for example, they'd say, "Who shall go up first? The tribe of Benjamin?" If the answer was no, then they'd ask the tribe of Ephraim, and the answer was no. Then they'd ask the tribe of Manasseh, and the answer was no. Then finally, when they said the tribe of Judah, evidently the answer at that point in time was yes. And then they, of course, ask always, will the Lord deliver the enemies into their hands? And they look for a yes answer there also. We don't know exactly how those answers were ascertained. We do know that it was definitely through these tools from the high priest, the Urim and Thummim. The Hebrew for that is lights and perfections, by the way. However, exactly what it is only a matter of speculation. Somehow, by the priests, they would inquire of the Lord and get directions regarding the battles that they were going to go into. And of that, we are certain. It talks about it a lot in the Old Testament. David did it quite often, seek the counsel of the Lord as to different battles and ask actually what the outcome of the battles would be. Wouldn't enter in without knowing that.
Here we know that it was indicated by God that Judah should go up first, and that God had delivered this land into his hand. Almost immediately, however, the tribe of Judah starts to show this major lack of faith.
They said to Simeon, his brother, "Come up with me into my lot, that we might fight against the Canaanites, and I likewise will go with you into your lot." So Simeon went with him.
It's truly amazing to me that we can be given a promise of victory from God, promise of deliverance, for example, yet we immediately turn and rely on the flesh instead of relying on the promises of God. We go and ask our friends for help. We might call our pastor and ask for help. We may do many other things to do so, and none of those are really wrong. It's just that we lack the faith to trust what God has told us. And here we see Judah promise that the land would be delivered into his hand. And what does he do? He turns to Simeon, his brother, and asks him for help. How often have each of us received a promise from God and immediately turned to the flesh to help us? It's sad, really, that we can't just rely on the Word of God and trust His Word to deliver what we've been promised.
Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they slew of them in Bezek 10,000 men.
Now, this city of Bezek must have been a good-sized city in order to have 10,000 fighting men living there. We know that there were families there, wives, mothers, children, daughters, sons, but to have actually 10,000 men of the age that was allowed to fight, and they did have ages in those days by which they would take them into the army, it must have been a huge city. It's interesting also that Bezek is a city which we do not today know the location. There's still a lot of towns that have not been excavated in Israel. It would be tempting to take a pick and shovel and go over to Israel and start digging away and picking away at some of those tells to see what we could find. We have no way of knowing what resources might just lie under the mound of dirt and what you might discover by doing.
And they found the Lord of Bezek, and they fought against him, and they slew the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But Adoni-Bezek fled, and so they pursued after him, and they cut off his thumbs and his great toes.
Adonai in Hebrew means Lord. So this must have been the leader of these troops at Bezek. The purpose of cutting off their thumbs was to make sure it was impossible for them to use their bows. With your thumbs cut off, it would be really difficult to fight in a war anymore at all. You couldn't hold your sword, you couldn't draw your bow. They couldn't grasp their sword, and they wouldn't pull back on their bow because of the fact that their thumbs had been cut off. Cutting off the big toes would ensure slowing them down so that a person should not be able to run. It would stop them from running away. Balance is lost without the big toes, and running would be near impossible. Without a lot of practice anyway. The bottom line was that the purpose for taking off their big toes and thumbs was to incapacitate them for battle.
Adoni-Bezek said, "There have been 70 kings who had their thumbs and great toes cut off, who ate their meat at my table. As I have done, so God hath requited me." And they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died. So we read here that this guy, this Adoni-Bezek, wasn't an innocent man. What they did to him, he had already done to 70 other kings in his past. Now keep in mind that Paul told us that, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Now there's an interesting law of God that we reap in kind. I mean, it's a basic law of God, and this is one that He established to keep order in the universe. Our whole world would be a chaotic mess if this law had not ever been established by God. Whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. Now, in the physical realm, we know that if you sow corn, you're going to yield corn. If you sow wheat, you'll yield wheat. Farming industry would be in chaos if we didn't have this law in effect. But this law also holds true in the spiritual world. Scripture tells us that he that sows to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that sows of the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. It's extremely difficult not to sow to the flesh, especially in the world in which we live today. I mean, television makes sowing to the flesh such a simple, easy thing. It's easy to flip on the TV and get involved in some program, usually in the realm of someone else's reality, and all of which has no spiritual value whatsoever. It ministers to our flesh. I mean, we see it as exciting, and sometimes we'll see shooting, fast driving, excitement in other folks' lives, none of which is of the Spirit. Doesn't feed your spirit at all. It only feeds the flesh. Whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. And many times folks think that they're getting away with evil deeds. Many of us believe this, because God has a lot of patience. We can't escape this law, however. Ultimately, every one of us will say or think the same words as this Adonai Bezek. As I have done, so it has been done to me. We can't escape it. It's the law of God.
Now, this law of God does not need to be frightening to any of us. It's a blessing if you're actually sowing good seed. If you're sowing seed in the Spirit, God will bless you that way. If you're sowing love, kindness, mercy, for example, you'll reap love, kindness, and mercy. Now, if you're sowing rotten seed, you need to worry about that. It will come back to you. If you're sowing kindness, peace, and gentleness, you have no need to worry. Reaping is in kind with the law of God. You cannot escape the law of God. So, it should be a strong impetus to us to sow good seed in the Spirit and not unrighteousness.
Now the children of Judah had fought against Jerusalem and taken it, and they had smitten it with the edge of the sword, and they set the city on fire.
Now, as you can see, they conquered the city, but it's interesting that they didn't drive out the inhabitants of the city, the Jebusites. They didn't destroy them, and instead they allowed them to stay in the city. And as a result, ultimately, these Jebusites took control of the city, were able to control it all the way up till the time of David. They lived among the tribe of Judah during that time. God told them to utterly destroy the enemy, but they disobeyed.
Afterwards, the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites, the ones that dwelt in the mountain and in the south and in the valley. And Judah went against the Canaanites that dwell in Hebron. And they slew Sheshai, Iman, and Talmai. Now these were the three giants. And from there he went against the inhabitants of Debir. And Caleb said, he that smites Debir and takes it, to him I will give Aksah, my daughter, to wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, who's Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave Aksah his daughter to wife. And it came to pass that when she came to him, that she moved him to ask of her father a field. And she lighted off from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? And she said unto him, give me a blessing, for you have given me a southland. Now give me also springs of water. And so Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And the children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up out of the city of palm trees, now that's Jericho, with the children of Judah to the wilderness.
Now in Judges, in order to take a wife, you usually had to pay a dowry. It was customary to go to the girl's father and barter with them and agree on the number of donkeys or camels and sheep that would be a proper dowry for a wife. The father was then responsible to keep that dowry intact, and he was actually expected to increase it Now, possible through investments, or however he could, but his job was to increase that dowry during the time of the marriage. You see, women in those days had no rights. Husband could pretty well just write a bill of divorcement, hand it to her, kick her out. She'd be on her own. She could do nothing about it. The dowry was advance alimony, basically, in case a jerk husband were to kick her out. The father would then have enough dowry so she didn't have to go out on welfare or look for other ways to do that or live on the streets. It's a pretty good custom to protect the rights of women. Men who didn't have enough money to buy a bride were left single, unless a father would offer them a challenge. Now, the way that works, if the father wanted a city, for example, he'd offer the hand of his daughter to any man who would take that city. Here we see how Othniel, inspired by this challenge, took the city and it became his dowry. So Caleb gave his daughter a field, and she asked Othniel to ask her dad to give them some springs so they could water the crops and take care of the fields and basically have a complete farm. Now, evidently, he didn't want to ask Caleb for anything himself, so he sent his wife to ask. And when she did, he gave her both the upper and lower springs. Daughters can usually get stuff from dad that their husbands or boyfriends cannot, especially the man that they marry in a case like this.
Now that part, now the children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, if you remember back when the children of Israel were entering the desert, Moses asked his brother-in-law to go with them. And that was because they were wise people about the desert. I mean, they knew how to find water, how to track, and they had general survival skills. Now, Hobab told Moses no, and it was because of the rough time ahead. But evidently they changed their mind and came because they're still with the children of Israel at this point. Now, they were in the city of palm trees. Now, that's actually Jericho. And however, being nomadic folks from the desert, they went down to inhabit this area because it's more like the area from where they came, down in the Sinai Peninsula.
Now, Arad is a pretty desolate wilderness. It's approximately 12 miles in a direct line from Arad to the Dead Sea. It's another 20 miles south from Arad to Beersheba. It's a rocky, desolate place, but it's a perfect area where folks could graze their sheep.
Judah went with Simeon, his brother, and they slew the Canaanites that inhabited Zephath, utterly destroyed it. And the name of the city was called Hormah. Also, Judah took Gaza on the south coast by the Mediterranean, with the coast thereof, and Ascalon, that's north of Gaza towards Tel Aviv, with the coast thereof, and Ekron with the coast thereof. They are three of the Philistine cities. And the Lord was with Judah. He drove out the inhabitants of the mountains, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron.
Now, this statement that he could not drive them out because they had chariots of iron is not a truly factual statement. You see, God had promised to deliver the enemy into their hands, and had they had enough faith, had they really gone out to fight them, God would have delivered them. There's no doubt about that. God said, I have delivered the enemies. It was done. There was a promise from God, but they were not acting upon that promise. They were stopped by fear because they saw these chariots. Chariots were kind of the tanks of those days. They were decisive weapons of battle. Infantry couldn't do much against tanks. These folks were afraid. That fear is what really kept them from conquering, not the chariots. The statement probably should have been something like, he did not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because he saw that they had chariots of iron and he became afraid. How many times do we stop short of what God wants to do for us? And it's simply because we get hesitant and fearful. We see the things in front of us, they scare us. We worry about what the results might be or what people might think or say if we follow through. I know in my heart that God has so much more for all of us, but we get to back away when we see the power and the entrenchment of our enemy. I'm certain that the Israelites could have taken the whole place had they just trusted in God and gone forward instead of being hesitant and fearful because of chariots of iron, etc., etc.
And so they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses said, and he expelled from there the 3 sons of Anak. Then the children of Benjamin, here we see the tribes moving in and take their various areas that have been apportioned to each of them, did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin unto this day. And the house of Joseph, which is Ephraim and Manasseh, they went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph sent to descry Bethel. Now the name of the city before was Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said unto him, Show us, we pray you, the entrance into the city, and we'll show you mercy. And when he showed them the entrance into the city, they smote the city with the edge of the sword, and they let go the man and all of his family. And the man went into the land of the Hittites, and he built the city, and called the name of it Luz, which is the name thereof unto this day.
Isn't it interesting that a lot of those ancient cities had secret entrances to them? I mean, the secret entrance was usually the route along the path from where they got their water. A Megiddo person could hike down to the area of the springs from which Megiddo once got its water supply. Knowing that there was an invading army coming, they dug this tunnel through the rock from within the city out to the springs. The water from the springs came through the rock tunnel to sort of a well area. They sealed the outside entrance to the spring with rocks so that it was hidden. This was so that when they got under siege in the city, they had a tunnel through the rocks so they had access to water throughout the time that they were there. A siege was normally where an enemy army would surround the city, try to starve you out, hold you from getting water, and hope that you'd just give up eventually. We see the same thing in Jerusalem. The spring of Gihon was outside the city walls of Jerusalem. And when Hezekiah knew that the Assyrian army was coming, they began to dig a tunnel through the rock from Gihon under the city walls to the pools of Siloam. Other diggers started at the pool of Siloam, and digging through solid rock some 1,700 feet, they finally met up with the tunnels. It's possible to go through the tunnel, wading through the water out of the spring of Gihon, and to pass through that dark tunnel from the spring of Gihon to the pool of Siloam. This too was dug in order to create inter-city access to the water supply to provide during a time of siege. In this case, they got hold of this guy and they threatened to kill him and his family if he would not show them the entrance to the city. So he showed them the secret entrance to Bethel. Through this knowledge, they conquered the city. But they left the guy alive. He moved out and he built another city. He named it after the city of Luz, which was the name of Bethel before it became Bethel.
However, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean. Now, Beth Shean is just north of Mount Gilboa. If you look at the map, you'll see it's just on the bottom right-hand corner with the red star. Give you an idea of the location. There are some amazing ruins at Beth Shean today. In fact, they've done a lot of excavation at Beth Shean. They uncovered a huge amphitheater. It's actually much like the amphitheater in Caesarea. Right next to the amphitheater, they uncovered this beautiful theater that goes back, well, dates back to the Roman period. Beth Shean is a place where the Philistines actually hung Saul on the wall after they had killed him. Today it's a modern Israeli village, but the ruins are really quite spectacular. So we know from all of this city dates back to the time of Joshua. neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean. You see, they didn't obey the command of God. They left the inhabitants there. Nor of Tanakah and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Dor, nor of Ibleam, nor of Megiddo, but the Canaanites would dwell in the land. It came to pass when Israel was strong that they taxed them. They basically put them under tribute. But they did not drive them out. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer. Neither did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron. Neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko or of Zidon. The Asherites dwell among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, and they did not drive them out. Neither did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or Beth Anah, but they just taxed them. So you see, the tribes did not totally possess the land, and they didn't totally wipe out the enemy. I keep emphasizing this because this became the thorn in their sides. It's exactly what Joshua said. His prophecy was fulfilled. If you do not drive them utterly out, then they will become thorns in your sides, and they will be a snare unto you. Now, in a spiritual sense, the promises that God has given to you is for a full, rich life in the Spirit. In order to come into a full, rich life in the Spirit, we have to gain victory over the flesh, because these two are antagonistic and opposed to each other. The flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, and these two are contrary. It's a never-ending battle that goes on between our flesh and our spirit, a rivaling for the mastery of your life, that you'll either be ruled by the flesh or you'll be ruled by the Spirit. Now, it's possible to begin to conquer over those areas of the flesh, but we can't do it in ourselves. God has promised victory. The Lord has promised to go before us and fight the battles for us, just like he did for Israel all the way through the Old Testament. Through the help of God, I can gain the victory over the life of the flesh. So can you. I don't have to be ruled by my flesh. If I will go in by the power of God's Spirit, I can see God's hand of deliverance.
If I allow or tolerate an area of the flesh to remain, it's possible for me to be caught up again in that area of the flesh and to be defeated entirely. Now, this is true even though I've known victories in the Spirit and I've had glorious experiences of God's victory in my own life. It's important that we continue to move on in the realm of the Spirit, not stopping, not making an alliance with the flesh, and not allowing the flesh to remain. We have to continue on in our victory and in our conquest over those areas of the flesh that we're fighting. It's a never-ending battle, and as long as I'm living in this body, I'm going to be problemed with my flesh. It's a continuous thing. It never goes away. We have to trust God and follow through with that. To give up to an area of the flesh or to tolerate the flesh in our lives is only to court disaster and defeat. That's the main lesson of the book of Judges, their incomplete victories. Over and over they decided to allow the inhabitants of Canaan to remain, and they just taxed them as punishment. This was an alliance with the flesh. Have you ever heard anyone say, well, that's just a part of my flesh life. I have a bad temper. If you don't like it, I'm sorry, and there's not much I can do about it. We've all had friends that have said those kinds of things to us. Maybe not word for word, but something to that effect. We just give in to it instead of pressing on into victory in the Lord. Instead of asking God to deliver us from the nasty attitude or the complexities of our own attitude and anger, from the cutting spirit, we just give in. I don't want to be ruled by my flesh. I do not want to be ruled by my flesh. I don't want my flesh to destroy me.
Paul said, make no provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. Basically, don't make a provision to live at peace with your flesh. You'll never be able to do it. Now, unfortunately, the tribe of Dan just didn't even take their land. The Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountain, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. And the Amorites would dwell in Mount Heres, in Ajalon, and in Shalbim. And the hand of the house of Joseph prevailed, so that they became tributaries. And the coast of the Amorites was from the going of Akabram from the rock and upward. So the tribe of Dan just didn't even take the land, didn't conquer anything, and they didn't obey the command of God because of that. They did not utterly drive out their enemy.
Thank God I don't have to be ruled by my flesh. God doesn't want me to be ruled by my flesh. He wants me to be ruled by the Spirit. Now, the book of Judges is a prime example of those things that God does for us. He did it for them. We basically are the same as the people of Israel in God's eyes. And in all these accounts that you see, not just here in the book of Judges, but throughout the Old Testament, you'll find that God does three things in our lives. Number one, He prepares us. He helps us get through things, helps us conquer those things of the flesh, helps us get prepared for where we're going. He has a plan for our entire life, and He knows where we're going to end up. So He prepares us. That's number one. Number two, He goes ahead of us. There is no time with God, so He's ahead of us at every step of the way, preparing the path, preparing the way for us to get from point A to point B. And third, He actually goes to the place where He knows we're headed, and He prepares that place for us. So in our lives, we have to understand that God has a plan for us. It's already laid out. He knows what we're going to do. He knows where we're going to go, and He knows how it's going to end up. So our job is just simply to follow what God tells us to do. The way we find that out is through the Word. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word. You have to be in the Word every day, reading, praying, studying, to find out what God's plan is for your life. But rest assured of this, God does have a plan for you. He's in control of it. He knows where you're going, and He absolutely loves you from beginning to end. Now we're going to continue on in the book of Judges. I'm going to go chapter by chapter, do them in this video series. I sincerely hope that you'll join us, that you'll become part of this ministry, and check in on a regular basis. Now, if you become a member on YouTube, you'll get notices every time a new video comes out. I plan on doing at least one of these a week and posting it along with my normal Just My Thoughts that I'll be doing also. So in saying that and in closing, just want to say this is Don Stephens. These are just my thoughts. God bless you. Until next time.